The most famous athlete in the world walked into a college auditorium in 1968, and what happened in the next 8 minutes would be whispered about for 50 years. Muhammad Ali, stripped of his heavyweight title, facing 5 years in prison, banned from boxing in every state, stood before 200 students at a small Midwestern university. Among them sat a man whose rage had been building for 18 months, a fury so justified that even Ali's supporters would later admit they understood it. What no one expected was that the confrontation would end not with a knockout, but with an embrace that redefined what strength really means. Spring 1968. The nation bled from 1,000 wounds. Martin Luther King Jr. had been assassinated 3 weeks earlier. Cities burned. The Vietnam War devoured 58,000 American lives, while protesters chanted in the streets. And Muhammad Ali, once Cassius Clay, the Louisville Lip, the man who shook up the world, had become the most polarizing figure in America. 14 months had passed since he refused induction into the U.S. Armed Forces, citing his Muslim faith and moral opposition to the war. The boxing establishment responded with surgical precision. They stripped his title, revoked his license in all 50 states, and ensured he couldn't earn a dollar in the only profession he'd ever known. He was 26 years old, at the absolute peak of his powers, and the government wanted him in prison. But Thomas Hendricks wasn't thinking about Ali's persecution. He was thinking about his younger brother, Michael, 21 years old, whose last letter from Da Nang had arrived 6 weeks ago. Folded inside a plastic bag stained with jungle mud, Michael had written about the heat, about the monsoons that turned foxholes into graves, about the village children who waved at convoys before the bombs hit under the road. He'd written about a boxer back home who thought he was too good to serve, too righteous to share the burden that boys like Michael carried without choice. Thomas had carried that letter in his jacket pocket through Michael's funeral, through the flag-folding ceremony, through the 21-gun salute that cracked the April sky like God's judgment. Now he sat in the third row of this auditorium, Michael's Bronze Star, with V device, awarded for valor, in that same pocket, and his hands wouldn't stop shaking. Thomas was a graduate student in history, a man who believed in service, duty, honor concepts his father had taught him through bedtime stories about Normandy beaches and frozen Chosin Reservoir. His grandfather had limped back from World War I with shrapnel in his hip. The Hendricks men answered when called. It was that simple. And now this boxer, this draft dodger, this man who claimed conscience while better men bled, stood at the podium, accepting applause from students who he'd never heard a rifle shot outside a movie theater. Ali spoke for 20 minutes about faith, about conscience, about the difference between physical courage and moral courage. His voice carried that familiar musical quality, but the bravado had been tempered by legal battles and exile. He talked about what it cost to stand alone, to lose everything for a principle, to be called a coward by a nation that once cheered his name. The students leaned forward. Some nodded. Thomas felt his jaw tighten with each word. The moderator opened the floor for questions. Hands shot up. A young woman asked about the Supreme Court case. A theology student inquired about Islamic teachings on war. Ali answered each with patience, with humor, with the intelligence that his public persona often concealed. The audience relaxed. They laughed. They were being charmed. And Thomas felt something hot and sharp rising in his chest like floodwater behind a failing dam. He stood. The movement was abrupt, graceless. His chair scraped against the floor with a sound like a record scratch. The auditorium fell silent. Ali's eyes found him immediately, those eyes that had stared down Sonny Liston, that had danced and calculated and read opponents' souls. Thomas's voice shook, but not from fear. You talk about courage. You talk about sacrifice. He pulled the Bronze Star from his pocket, held it up so the stage lights caught the dull gold. My brother earned this 3 months ago. He was 21. He didn't get to choose whether to go. He didn't have lawyers and cameras and people calling him brave for staying home. The medal trembled in his fist. He believed you were a hero. He had your picture on his wall. And he died in a rice paddy while you gave speeches about conscience. The silence deepened, became physical. Students shifted in their seats. Someone coughed. The moderator half rose from his chair, then sat back down. Ali stood motionless at the podium, his hands flat on the wooden surface. He wasn't preparing a counterattack. He was listening. My brother wrote me letters. Thomas's voice cracked. He told me about the heat, about the fear, about how they were fighting for democracy, for freedom, for people who'd never thank them. And he asked me, the words caught in his throat. He forced them out. He asked me why you got to be called brave. Well, he was just doing his job. Thomas's hand dropped to his side, the metal hanging from its ribbon like a pendulum marking the seconds. So I'm asking you now, Mr. Ali, in front of all these people who think you're some kind of prophet, what gives you the right? What makes your conscience more important than my brother's life? The room held its breath. Every person present understood they were witnessing something unprecedented. This wasn't a reporter's gotcha question or a politician's grandstanding. This was grief weaponized, pain given voice, moral authority earned in the cruelest classroom. Even Ali's critics would later admit that Thomas Hendricks had asked the question perfectly, had done what prosecution attorneys and television hosts could never accomplish. He'd made Ali's sacrifice seem small. Ali's hands lifted from the podium. He stepped away from the microphone, moved to the edge of the stage. His movements were slow, deliberate, empty of his famous grace. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, forcing the room to strain forward. What was your brother's name? Thomas blinked. Of all the responses he'd anticipated, justifications, religious rhetoric, political arguments, this gentle question disarmed him completely. Michael, he said, and hearing his own voice say it, broke something inside his chest. Ali nodded, once a gesture of acknowledgement that felt sacred. Michael, he repeated the name as if committing it to memory. Then he lowered himself to sit on the edge of the stage, legs dangling like a child's, eye level now with the front row. The informality of it, the vulnerability, shifted the entire dynamic. Can I tell you what nobody wants to hear? Ali's voice remained soft, conversational, as if the 200 witnesses had disappeared. Can I tell you the truth? I learned when everything got taken from me. Thomas said nothing, but he didn't sit down. Your brother was brave? I mean, that he was braver than me in ways that matter. Ali's hands opened, palms up. He went. He served. He gave everything. And the men who sent him there, the generals, the politicians, the ones who never hear the bullets, they love when we fight about who's more righteous. They love when you hate me and I defend myself. Because while we're arguing about conscience and cowardice, they're sending more Michaels into the jungle. A student in the back started to applaud, but Ali raised a hand, stopping it. No, no applause. This isn't a speech. His eyes never left Thomas. I didn't refuse service because I'm better than your brother. I refused because I couldn't be him. I couldn't go to a country that never called me nigger and kill people who never lynched my ancestors for a government that won't let me eat at half the lunch counters in the South. That was my truth, my limit, my line. Thomas felt his legs weaken, but he remained standing. The metal in his hand seemed heavier now. But your brother had his truth too. Ali's voice grew stronger, finding rhythm. He believed in duty, in honor, in protecting something bigger than himself. And he went and he died for it. And that Ali pointed at the metal, that means something real. That's not fake. That's not propaganda. That's your brother's conviction made flesh. The auditorium had gone beyond silent into something else, a collective suspension where 200 people forgot to breathe. Ali slid off the stage, landed on his feet with a soft thud. He walked up the aisle toward Thomas, his movement stripped of showmanship, just a man approaching another man in pain. He stopped 3 feet away. I cannot give you your brother back. I cannot tell you his sacrifice wasn't real because it was real to him. It cost him everything. Ali's eyes glistened, and I can't tell you mine was bigger or more important. Because how do you measure that? How do you weigh one man's conviction against another's? You could have gone, Thomas said, but the accusation had lost its edge, become a question instead. I could have, and it would have killed something in me. Just like not going killed something in your brother, the chance to stay home, to refuse, to say no. Ali's hands spread wide. We were both trapped, brother, just in different cages. Thomas's voice dropped to a whisper. They called him a baby killer. At the airport, when his unit came home, protesters spit on him. Ollie's face contorted, and for the first time the famous composure cracked. That's wrong. That's so wrong. He took another step closer. Your brother wasn't the enemy. My fight isn't with him. My fight is with the men who put us all in this position, who make young men choose between prison and killing, between conscience and duty, and then tell us we can't both be right. But someone has to serve, Thomas said, and Nellie was pleading, trying to find solid ground. If everyone refused, then maybe they'd have to fight their own wars. Ali's voice rose for the first time, not in anger, but in passion. Maybe if every soldier was a senator's son, we'd find other ways to solve problems. Maybe if the men who declared wars had to fight them, there'd be fewer wars to fight. Thomas felt something shifting inside him, tectonic plates of belief grinding against each other. He believed in it. My brother, he really believed. I know he did. And that belief was real. It was honorable. I'm not mocking it. Ali reached out, slowly, telegraphing the movement so Thomas could step back if he wanted. He didn't. Ali's hand settled on his shoulder, gentle, the touch of a man who knew what it was to be both warrior and healer. Your brother and I, we were both casualties of the same war, just on different fronts. The tears came then, sudden and complete. 18 months of grief that Thomas had trapped behind rage and righteousness. His shoulders shook. The Bronze Star slipped from his fingers, hit the floor with a metallic ping that sounded like a question mark. Ali caught Thomas as he crumpled forward, held him the way you'd hold a brother, and somewhere in the audience, a woman began to cry. They stood there in the aisle, the most famous conscientious objector in America and a graduate student who, he lost everything, while 200 people watched something that couldn't be choreographed or faked. Thomas sobbed into Ali's shoulder, and Ali held him, saying nothing, because there was nothing left to say. The moderator's eyes were wet. A student in the front row pressed her palm to her mouth. An elderly professor who'd served in Korea bowed his head. When Thomas finally pulled back, his face red and streaked, Ali retrieved the medal from the floor. He held it in both hands like a holy relic, studied it for a long moment, then pressed it back into Thomas's palm and closed the young man's fingers around it. Your brother earned this. You honor him by carrying it. And when people ask you about him, you tell them he was brave. You tell them he served with conviction. And you tell them that Muhammad Ali said so. His voice grew fierce. You tell them that disagreeing about the war doesn't add disrespecting the warrior. Thomas nodded, unable to speak. Ali guided him back to his seat, with a hand on his shoulder, waited until he sat, then returned to the stage. He didn't continue his speech. He simply stood at the podium, looking out at faces that had just witnessed something they'd struggled to explain to friends later. That man's pain is real, Ali said finally, and it's not my job to dismiss it or minimize it or win an argument against it. We can both be right. We can both be wrong. We can both be human. He paused, gathering himself. That's what they don't want us to know. They want us to think it's simple. Coward or hero, right or wrong, us or them. But it's not simple. It's never been simple. He left the stage to silence, not the hostile silence of the confrontation, but the reverent quiet of a congregation after a difficult sermon. Thomas sat with his head in his hands, the medal pressed against his forehead. Students around him reached out, a hand on his back, a squeeze of his shoulder, offering the wordless comfort of shared witness. 17 years later, in 1985, Thomas Hendricks published a book called The Brother I Lost and the Enemy I Found. It became required reading in peace studies programs across the country. In it, he described that night in exhaustive detail, but the passage that appeared in every excerpt, every review, every syllabus was this: Ali didn't tell me I was wrong. He didn't tell me Michael died for nothing. He told me that two truths could exist simultaneously, that honor wasn't proprietary, that my brother's courage and his conviction could occupy the same moral universe without negating each other. That was the bravest thing I'd ever heard someone say. Thomas became a mediator, specializing in veteran affairs and conscientious objector cases. He traveled to high schools and colleges, bringing together Iraq War veterans and peace activists, creating spaces where people could honor each other's choices without abandoning their own beliefs. When journalists asked him about his methodology, he always said the same thing. I learned it from Muhammad Ali in 8 minutes in 1968. He taught me that the opposite of an enemy is not a friend. It's a more complete understanding. In 2016, Thomas stood in the Louisville rain at Ali's funeral, the same bronze star in his pocket. Older now and tarnished, but still carried. He was 69 years old, a grandfather, a professor emeritus, a man who'd spent half a century trying to practice the lesson that night had taught him. A reporter noticed him crying and asked if he'd known Ali personally. He knew me, Thomas said, on the worst night of my life, when I tried to hurt him with my pain. He knew me better than I knew myself. The other attendees from that 1968 auditorium, those who could be tracked down, those still living, told remarkably consistent stories. They remembered the silence. They remembered the embrace. And they remembered leaving the building, changed in ways they couldn't articulate, carrying a new understanding that felt fragile and precious, like a truth too complex for the world that waited outside. This is what courage looks like when it's complicated. This is what strength sounds like when it admits uncertainty. This is what healing requires, not the erasure of pain or the victory of one narrative over another, but the brutal, beautiful work of holding space for contradictions, for competing truths, for the possibility that honor isn't a zero-sum game where one man's righteousness requires another's shame. Muhammad Ali could have destroyed Thomas Hendricks that night. I could have used his famous wit to humiliate, his rhetorical skill to eviscerate, his moral authority to crush. Instead, he asked a question. What was your brother's name? And in that question, in the space between attack and response, he created room for something more important than being right. He created room for being human.